make your way to your seats. Thank you. Hello, everybody. How was lunch? I thought lunch was really good. So thank you all for being here today. Thank you all for being here today. My name is Kelly Friedlander, and I have the honor of introducing Rebecca Cokley to you all. She is a true pioneer in advocating for disability rights and inclusion. Her tireless work has significantly advanced the rights and inclusion of people with disabilities in society and in the workforce. Her story in this movement as impactful as it is personal. Her family has a rich legacy in the disability community. Rebecca's family has 3 generations of little people in it, going back to her parents, Billy and Joan, who met at a Little People of America conference when they were teenagers. She was raised in the San Francisco Bay Area, steeped in disability justice activism. Empowered and informed by her lived experience, she has continuously worked to bend the arc of the moral universe towards justice. At her previous employment at the Center for American Progress, Rebecca co-founded the Disability Justice Initiative, where she fiercely protected services for disabled people and pushed forward progressive policies. She also has been at the forefront of many campaigns and has gotten presidential candidates to focus on disability policies. That is quite some impact. She was also the former executive director of the National Council on Disability, where she tackled tough issues such as sexual violence on campuses, police reform, and the rights of disabled parents. She is a 3-time presidential appointee who is shaping policy on education and health, and she was the diversity and inclusion leader for the Obama administration. Currently, she's working at the Ford Foundation, where she leads their disability rights program. As a liaison to the President's Council on Disability Inclusion and Philanthropy, she's making sure that disability inclusion is part of their philanthropy efforts. She isn't just a policy expert. In addition to all of her other stuff, she is a very sought after speaker and media contributor on public policy and disability inclusion. A dynamic force in disability rights, she has been instrumental in fortifying the field, fostering diverse leadership, and advocating for disability pride. Today, she is joining us via Zoom to delve into the critical issues of housing for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, a subject close to her heart. Please join me in welcoming Rebecca Cokley to the Hope Housing Summit.
Thank you so much. It is a pleasure to be here with all of you virtually. I am not turning my camera on because in addition to all of those wonderful accolades, at the end of the day, the most important job I have is as a mom. And for those of you that are moms, you understand that there's times, moms or dads, there are times that your children truly gift you with things. And in this case, my children gifted me with pink eye. So while I would really love to be there with all of you in person, it is much better for all of us that I am remoting in. And so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let's see, here we go. Why is it doing? Okay. Housing as part of economic justice for the disability community. I want to welcome everybody. I want to pay particular attention to welcome all the people with disabilities and chronic illnesses in attendance, whether or not it's safe for you to self-identify publicly or professionally. We acknowledge your presence. Our community is infinitely strengthened by you being a voice in the room, and we are thankful for you being part of the fight. As introduced, my name is Rebecca Cokley. I have achondroplasia, which is the most common form of dwarfism. Both my parents had it, and 2 of my 3 children have it. And I have the pleasure of being a three-time presidential appointee. I ran diversity and outreach for President Obama. Probably the thing I'm proudest of is in 2020, we were successful in getting 13 different presidential candidates to write disability public policy platforms, which had never happened before the 2020 election. Unlike 80% of people with disabilities, I'm part of the 20% who really grew up inside the community. I grew up surrounded by a gloriously diverse, infinitely talented disability community in the Bay Area. For me, it was normal to know, people who were wheelchair users and lawyers, people who were blind chemists or video game designers in the early days of the video game market. And so it really fundamentally shifted the expectations I had for both myself and my community. I'm an adult fan of Lego. People that know me know that I'm always posting about my Lego builds. I'm a massive fan of the Liverpool Reds football team. And this 2 weeks ago was actually able to have a bit of a love fest moment with John Oliver from HBO's Last Week Tonight, talking about our mutual adoration for Mo Salah. And I'm a mom of 3. To sort of start off, no euphemisms need apply in this conversation. We are very deliberate in using the term disability and not using special needs, differently abled, supremely able, differential learning, any of the other euphemisms. Euphemisms don't work in this space when it comes to civil rights. And disability is a term of civil right. Furthermore, I like to quote my former employee and dear friend Lawrence Carter Long, who says, "A need isn't special if other people get to take the same thing for granted." I think so often there's a tendency of using euphemisms when it relates to disability because non-disabled people are made uncomfortable. I'm sorry people are uncomfortable. That's a really hard place to be in. As a disabled person living in a world built by non-disabled people, I am uncomfortable about 90% of the day. And so this is a term that our community chose when writing the ADA. We were very deliberate in using this term. We see it as both a cultural and a movement/small p political affiliation. And so it's a term that I use in all of my work. It's important to note that the disability community is over 20% of the population. And as of 2018, disability funding makes up less than 2% of all US grant making, and 0.2% of that 2% is what actually goes to disability rights and advocacy work. A majority of disability funding centers on charity giving and extracurricular activities. This is a slide I actually was debating how to have this conversation, and so I actually threw it together this morning. If you have ever seen the last good Indiana Jones movie, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, in the final moments, Indy meets with one of the Knights Templar, and he has to choose which grail is the grail that's the original cup. And the Knights Templar gentleman warns him that you must choose, but you must choose wisely. And I think it's important to note that disabled people do not have equal access to make choices about their lives as non-disabled people. I think there is this assumption that the services and supports that currently exist are molded to the needs of the person with a disability. They're not. They're molded to the needs of the system. And so a great example I like to give is when I was working in the Obama administration, then Senator, actually, at the time he was in the Senate office, there was a Senate intern for President Obama, who was an individual that had multiple disabilities and wanted to go to law school and applied and got into a number of top tier schools, including Harvard. And Harvard offered him a full ride. And Kevin had to turn down the full ride because the more he looked into it, when he looked at transferring his Medicaid services, the services that he needed to feed and bathe him, to help him in and out of his wheelchair, to turn him at night so he didn't get bed sores. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts at the time would only give Kevin 6 hours versus the 12 hours that he got in Illinois. And so Kevin actually had to turn down a full ride to Harvard Law School. He ended up going to law school in Illinois. He works at a firm in Chicago and he's doing well for himself. But when you think about the fact that Kevin did not have the right to make the same choice as students without disabilities, Kevin lost out on the right to graduate with a Harvard Law School degree, which would have made his economic prospects dramatically different. He missed out on the ability to graduate law school with no debt, which in the ongoing conversations around college debt, it seems almost like a fantasy that somebody would have had this opportunity, and he had to turn it down because disabled people don't have the right to make the same choices as non-disabled people. And that plays out in all facets of our lives. There's not a choice that people with disabilities make that the first question is not asked, how will this impact my access to healthcare? How will this impact my economic well-being? You don't get to take the same risks. You might not get to work at a startup. You might not get to, work for your brother-in-law who has a really zany idea that could eventually earn him millions, because you have to think about the broader impact on you and your life. And that those choices also extend to the role of family makers or family members in the lives of people with disabilities. And so I think starting off there, it's really important to highlight that, and I can't stress that enough, is that it really starts with the fact that we don't have the same choices as non-disabled people. So when you think about poverty and disability, here on the screen is a picture of an Ouroboros, which is a snake that eats its own tail. It's a circle that goes on and on and on. Disability and poverty are causes and consequences of each other. We know that if you're poor, you're more likely to be disabled, and if you're disabled, you're more likely to be poor. People with disabilities make up a majority of the low-wage workforce and the unemployed. For a long time, we used to talk about the 8 F's of disability employment, which are the jobs that people with disabilities traditionally get steered into. They're food, filth, fetching, folding, filing, flowers, festive, and friendly. Those are the career paths that often people with disabilities, and specifically people with intellectual disabilities, get steered into. Now, it's important to note that, as I said, choice is really important, and that people with disabilities may in fact choose to go into these professions, but we really feel strongly that people should have a right to make those choices. But even then, those are the professions that often result in having the lowest wages. We know that 1/3 of GoFundMes in this country or other similar crowdfunding platforms, 1/3 of those accounts are set up by or for disabled people that are intending to cover an expense that insurance is refusing to cover. Most often, it tends to be access to equipment, access to testing or assessments, access to home, the ability to modify one's home or one's workplace to make it more accessible. Many disabled people cannot have more than $2,000 in their bank account, nor can they marry. These arcane asset limits rules that were set up under the Fair Labor Standards Act going back to the New Deal. The idea was that there are deserving poor and undeserving poor. And the idea is that, people with disabilities should expect society to take care of them. This is very antiquated and extremely outdated. And we're actually really excited to know that there's bipartisan legislation in the House of both the House and the Senate right now, referred to as the Asset Act, that would actually lift it from $2,000 for an individual to $10,000, and for a family or a couple from $3,000 to $20,000. Most people often don't realize, additionally, that these arcane rules result in what's often called a Medicaid divorce, which is a case where, because of a family member's disability or because you may in fact acquire a disability and need to access Medicaid for health insurance purposes, that families actually are forced to get divorced to be able to meet those asset limits, which is just, it's one of the things that keeps me up at night. It just enrages me. We know that households with a disability presence require 28% more income, which approximately is about $17,000 to $20,000 a year, to maintain the equal standard of living as a household without a disabled person. And a lot of that is because of arcane asset requirements, rules about what insurance will and will not cover, and just frankly, the labor cost analysis that it takes to manage being disabled in terms of paperwork and bureaucracy. And housing is a key part of this. We know that roughly 14.4 million households with at least one person with a disability can't afford their housing. That's like 41% of households with a person with a disability in them. 43% of homeless adults who stay in a shelter have a self-reported disability. About 2.4 million households with non-elderly people with disabilities, including 1 million families with children, have worst case housing needs. Roughly 40% of all worst case housing needs exist in the US. There are two major problems that really lead to this: the lack of enforcement of existing laws, whether it be the Fair Housing Act, the ADA, Section 504 of the Rehab Act, and also lack of proper infrastructure, which includes service coordination across all these systems. I like to call this the aging disability elephant in the room that nobody wants to talk about. Often people are very comfortable talking about seniors living in place, aging in place, and less comfortable talking about people with disabilities aging in place. One of my first jobs in the Obama administration was working at the Administration for Community Living, which is the first federal agency of its kind that serves as an umbrella for both aging and disability services inside the Health and Human Services Administration. And there was a huge blow up between the aging and the disability community when even writing the mission statement for the organization. The aging community did not want the word empower listed in the mission because it implied that the aging community lacks power. And we know that they don't. We know what a powerful voice seniors can be, and in particular, organizations like AARP can be when it comes to issues around healthcare, access to transportation, housing, etc. The disability community did not want the word enable in the mission, which the aging community did want, because it implied that the disability community are unable to do things. And the reality is we should be able to do the same things as everyone else with the supports that we need to do that. Now, the challenge is that these communities tend to overlap more than they don't, but the systems that impact them have really created a false narrative that creates who's worthy and who's unworthy. And I think it's important when we're having conversations related to any sort of community-based services, whether it be housing, transportation, access to food, emergency management, any of these things, that we clearly talk about the ways that these communities do overlap and the commonality of needs without a moral-based framing about who's deserving of supports to live in the community and who isn't. Generational wealth. I think we hear a lot of conversations around the role of generational wealth, particularly in perpetuating systems of inequity. And I think it's important to note that often people with disabilities are prohibited from contributing to generational wealth. We know that generational wealth provides opportunities for future generations to benefit from hard work and success of someone's ancestors, enabling them to enjoy a higher quality of life, pursue chances and opportunities, and create their own wealth. We know that roughly 70% of generational wealth is transferred through real estate, but there are programs like Medicaid estate recovery, where after the death of a loved one, CMS can claim the property of someone who dies with a disability to recoup the cost that Medicaid put out for them. Also, as I said, these arcane spin down rules that if a Medicaid applicant is in a long-term care facility for 6 months or more, the agency will automatically presume that the applicant will be unable to return home and requires a selling of the house, regardless of who's currently living there. And I think it's a real challenge that when we think about what it means to create cyclical poverty across generations, getting at some of these really arcane rules and policies is going to be essential for us to move forward. We know less than 12% of adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities who receive long-term supports and services rent or own their own home. Less than 5% of the current housing supply is accessible, and less than 1% is actually wheelchair accessible. And the US is between roughly 3 to 6 million homes short of what the market actually needs to ensure a lack of homelessness. Part of these issues are also geography-based. States with the largest estimated number of non-institutionalized people with disabilities are California, Texas, New York, and Pennsylvania. But these states also have the largest number of renters with mobility impairments and housing problems in the US, and also have the largest share of home and community development block grants annually. And so while these might have the largest numbers of people with disabilities, they might not also equal the largest percentage, which we know is Puerto Rico, West Virginia, Kentucky, Arkansas, and Mississippi. And so how do we ensure that we have available housing stock where folks need it and they're able to access it? Part of it is through programs like low-income housing tax credits. The low-income housing tax credit program is regulated by the IRS. And the premise is that tax credits issued by the IRS get turned into equity, which is used to reduce the cost of development and the rent the developer needs to charge to cover expenses. Right now it's mostly centered in 1 and 2 bedroom units, and a little over $9 billion in tax credits have been used to produce almost 1.7 million units so far. But we actually need to see programs like this increase. We actually need to see much greater investment in these spaces. You know, there's an ongoing conversation about how to continue moving dollars towards housing choice vouchers, which allow the household the same benefits as HUD's public housing program, but in the private rental market. You know, roughly 2 million households are using these vouchers in the US. It's administered and funded through Section 811 at HUD, but there's actually ongoing partnerships between HUD and HHS because there's a realization that there needs to be more and greater coordination between these agencies. And a household with a voucher pays roughly 30% of its income for rent. In terms of public housing, just lost an AirPod, I'm sorry. Section 504 of the Rehab Act requires a percentage of units, roughly 5% for mobility and 2% for hearing and visual disabilities. But it's important to continue to reiterate, as I brought up earlier, that there is really zero enforcement. There is currently no active database of accessible housing units anywhere in the US. And so there is no requirement that people with disabilities get priority access to accessible units first. And so we have a system right now where roughly 1/3 of accessible units are being lived in by people without access needs, which is a real challenge. Individuals in public housing are also more likely to acquire a disability as a result of substandard materials and building construction, as a result of gentrification, crumbling infrastructure, things that we know all too well. And so, you know, we are building up these systems that essentially also create and exacerbate disability. And eligible disabled families for public housing include a disabled adult, but exclude a disabled child unless that child has a disabled parent. And so, you know, think about what it means for a family. Let's say they live in a 5-story walk-up and they have a child with a mobility disability and an intellectual disability, and the building doesn't have an elevator. And they're having to carry that wheelchair or that child up and down stairs every day to get them to and from school. The system is just currently set up in a way that it's logical to understand why it doesn't work and why we need significant changes moving forward. When it comes to private housing, we know that less than half of the units of HUD's multifamily housing portfolio are designated for people with disabilities. And these programs are also typically only accessible to people who have been homeless first. And so you're already having to have nothing to be able to access a little bit of something versus getting to people, you know, while they still have a place to live, while they're looking to transition, whether it be from a nursing home or some other congregate setting. And so it's driving people off the cliff to say, hey, you're off the cliff and I guess we should help you, versus getting to them before the car heads off the cliff. So in terms of policy recommendations, I mean, I think the biggest one is, and why I'm so glad to see so many of you in the room today, is there is a significant need to boost available housing supply. Housing is the key to everything. We know that if there's affordable, accessible, and integrated housing stock, people with disabilities are more likely to go to school. They're more likely to get jobs. They're more likely to contribute to to participate and live in the community. And part of what's really needed in that space is greater enforcement of the Fair Housing Act, the ADA, and Section 504. You know, we also need increased funding for the housing choice voucher. For folks that live in places that are currently inaccessible, we need to make it easier for people to make their homes accessible, whether it be, you know, adding a stair lift, adding a lower stair rail, if it means putting in, you know, a Google Home, which can substitute a sort of an in-house intercom system for folks. Thinking about what are the barriers that need to be eliminated and how do we create a trust fund where people can access the dollars they need to modify their home to live in their own home. You know, the last piece is, as we continue to, this is something we talk about all the time in our work at the Ford Foundation, is the need to develop cross-systems coordination and collaboration. There are very few legal requirements for agencies to get in the room with each other and have a conversation about somebody. And in particular, the beginning years of my work were focused on young people with disabilities. And I remember having the realization that as a young person with a disability, depending on the type of disability and the systems you were involved with, you could have up to 11 different individualized plans, whether it be plan for schooling, mental health services, if you were in foster care, if you were, involved in the carceral system, if you were the child of someone involved in the carceral system. And there was no legal requirement that all of these agencies talk to each other, which to me is just completely ridiculous. And we wonder why folks fall through the systems and why there are gaps and cliffs. It's because there really is minimal to no cross-system coordination and collaboration. And that's where I wrap it up and see what kind of questions folks have. I'm happy to talk a little bit about Ford's work in the space, and equally happy to answer any sorts of questions. I will remind folks that my major background is not in housing policy, it's in economic justice. And so happy to answer questions in that vein, but wanted to hear from all of you.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. So we have Tally with a microphone. Does anybody have a question? One second, Rebecca. It's the person the farthest in the back of the room.
Got to make sure Tally gets her steps in, huh?
That's right. A lot of sitting for a conference, so.
Hi, Rebecca. Jillian Copeland from Main Street Connect. Thank you so much for all that you are doing for our communities, our broader community as well. Can you share a little bit about what Ford Foundation is doing?
Absolutely.
That'd be great.
I like to give a little bit of our origin story because I think it's important because it talks about how we've had to really shift things. In 2015, our CEO came on board, Darren Walker, and Darren was very public in his decision to move all of Ford's resources towards the causes of social justice. And when he talked about social justice, he talked about racial justice, immigrant justice, gender justice, LGBT justice. And probably of no surprise to people in the room, it was ABD, or what we say in the disability space is all but disability. And so the reality is a bunch of activists, myself included, proceeded in trolling the Ford Foundation on the internet. And so anytime Ford was anywhere, we hopped on their social media and talked about what it meant that people with disabilities were not included in their grant making. And so, for example, there was a meeting that our CEO was at talking about the Black-white wealth gap. And we said, that's great, but are you going to talk about the 200,000 people with disabilities who are in sub-minimum wage workshops in this country that make as little as $2.15 per week, and how a majority of them are people of color, and that they're not factored into the conversations about the wealth gap? They were at a gender-based violence conference, and we talked about the fact that if you ignore the fact, we know that specifically young women with intellectual and developmental disabilities have the highest rates of sexual abuse and assault in this country. Roughly 80% of young women with Down syndrome are raped or assaulted by the age of 18. And, we were like, you will never eliminate gender-based violence as long as disability isn't at the table. And to his credit, it only took about a month or two. He invited a bunch of us in to talk to him. And he said, I'm not going to ask you all to stop trolling me yet, even though it'd be very nice if you did. And he said, what I'm asking you is to teach me because I know absolutely nothing about disability. And he said, I've worked on economic justice my entire life, and I never thought about the fact that the majority of folks with disabilities, the majority of people in poverty are disabled. And so it really sort of like, I don't want to say it broke his brain, but like that emoji of like the explosion around the brain and like the mushroom cloud that comes out, that was sort of what he experienced. And so it started with him. He was not used to being told he knew nothing about an entire subject matter before. And so he brought in experts. And so he brought in Judy Heumann and Catherine Hyde Townsend to oversee what shifts Ford needed to make operationally, both in terms of our existing grant making areas, so creativity and free expression, civic engagement in government, future of workers, natural resources and climate change, gender, racial, ethnic justice. And so each of those teams had to look across their portfolios and think about what are disability organizations we want to fund, and also how can we make sure disability is weaved into our existing grant making to mainstream organizations. And then Judy worked predominantly on working to make sure that our buildings were accessible, that we had licensed interpreters on board, we had access to captioning, our website was 508 compliant, all of our videos were captioned, etc. That wasn't enough. So then he pulled together roughly 17 other foundations and said, hey, do you all want to go in with me on this? Because as we said, less than 2% of philanthropic dollars goes towards the disability community, and 0.2% of that goes to disability rights work. And so they created what's called the President's Council on Disability Inclusion and Philanthropy, which to date is 18 foundations, national and local foundations that contribute to a disability inclusion fund that grant makes to grassroots disabled-led organizations, commits to hiring people with disabilities on their staff, and also commits to integrating disability into their existing grant making. That wasn't enough. So at the end of the previous administration, they reached out to me, and I had been a grantee at the time in my work over at the Center for American Progress. And they said, hey, we'd really like to do more. Would you, are you going to go back into the White House? And I said, no. Because honestly, what I really wanted to create, and I'll share this with all of you, was an office on disability at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, because of how frequently we know that people with disabilities are subjected to fraud and are targeted for cases of fraud. And so that to me was what I wanted to do. The Biden administration did not want to do that. So I went to go work at Ford. And my portfolio is, I have an $8 million a year portfolio, which is the first of its kind in philanthropy, that focuses specifically on economic justice and disability. And when we look at economic justice, it is both driving systemic change on key advocacy issues, like I had mentioned, the Asset Act legislation that's going through the House and the Senate right now. And so supporting advocates and disabled voices and weighing in on policy recommendations that would actually improve the lives of people with disabilities and help disconnect the inevitability of disability and poverty. Also, it was funding disabled economists because we did not have good data. And the data that we had wasn't cross disability. It wasn't, it didn't look across gender or race. And as a result of us funding the publishing of better and more accurate disability economic data, the Department of Labor has actually shifted how they collect and release data to be more inclusive of race and gender in their publishing of disability data, where before they weren't. It's building a field that can drive an advocacy agenda, and it's going beyond sort of the anchor legacy disability organizations, groups like the ARC of the United States, Easter Seals, I'm trying to think of else, March of Dimes, Special Olympics, sort of the old guard of the disability community, and looking at how do we build capacity in new spaces and new ways. And so it's funding groups like Communication First, which is the first organization led by people with disabilities who use augmentative communication boards to talk because they have voices and we think their voices need to be heard. It's funding trade associations. Our community does not have trade associations. When you think about what it means to be part of a trade association, have access to mentoring, professional development, see people like you in the fields that you want to aspire to be part of, the lack of that for disabled people is really jarring and has a real impact on their economic well-being. And so the first year we funded a Disabled Journalists Association. 2 years ago, we funded the launch of docs with disabilities, which are doctors and healthcare workers with disabilities. We thought that was particularly important during the pandemic. And then this last year, because of issues of education reform, and particularly issues around seclusion and restraint of disabled students in public schools, we decided to work with the National Education Association to fund a disability and chronic illness caucus inside the teachers' unions. Because we know people with disabilities are disproportionately likely to go into the field of special education, either because they had a great time or because they had a terrible time and they want to reform it. And we want to make sure that teachers with disabilities and chronic illnesses are supported in staying in the profession. And so that's been a key part of it as well. And so it's building, sort of constituency organizations, trade associations, and really fleshing out the economic work to ensure that any proposal going forward that centers on economic justice won't hurt people with disabilities, because I think that's also part of the conversation. Like earlier on during the pandemic, the first evolution of the child tax credit was not stackable with disability benefits. So people with disabilities who were parents could actually lose their Medicaid if they received the child tax credit. And so working to make sure that that was not going to be the case. Working to make sure that as there are conversations about any sort of reparations legislation, for example, California passed a reparations bill for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities who were sterilized as a result of being in institutions, and working to make sure that legislation like that is stackable with existing benefits. Because what good is giving people is restoring justice for a community if then they're going to lose their health insurance as a result of it.
Rebecca, I have a quick question. So Rebecca can see all of you in the audience, and I just want her to get a sense of who is here today. So if you are a person with a disability with lived experience, can you please kind of raise your hand and wave it if able? Okay, so we have some. If you are a professional in the field or an ally, can you raise your hand and wave it? More. And if you are a family member of somebody with IDD. So as you can see in our audience, we have a lot of very dedicated and passionate individuals. And we also have a lot of individuals that are pretty tired, because as you know, systemic change is a long game. And I'm wondering, do you have any advice for our attendees about how to engage in systems change while maintaining their sanity?
Eat lunch every day. It's going to sound silly. Before Twitter was a dumpster fire, I used to tweet about eating lunch every single day, because I had a day where I realized I talked to 30 women with disabilities in advocacy roles one afternoon, and we realized that none of us ate lunch. And it's going to sound silly, but it was always like something we saw as an extra, like, or a reward, like, oh, if I finish this one task, I'll eat lunch. Friends, not eating lunch is an eating disorder. It's disordered eating, which is a disability in itself. And so the systems don't care if you don't eat lunch, but eating lunch is essential to our survival. So eat lunch, hydrate. Food, rest is not a bonus. It's an essential human need. And I think, just as you would say, we don't want to deprive people with disabilities of those things, allies need those things to be part of the fight as well. I think continuing to find new and different people to work with is part of what makes this work exciting. I think one of the things that's very powerful about the definition of disability in the ADA is that it's continually evolving. Who makes up our community is continually evolving. If it was a checklist, we wouldn't include people with long COVID. If it was a checklist, it wouldn't have included people with HIV and AIDS, which is why they did not do it as a checklist in 1990 to begin with, because they knew that there was a desire to keep those folks out. It includes people who acquire disabilities as a result of lead contamination. And I think particularly I want to say something to the women in the room. It includes all those conditions that we historically have been told that we've made up, that are all in our heads, whether it's migraines, fibroids, fibromyalgia, myalgic encephalomyelitis, which used to be called chronic fatigue syndrome. These are all things that we've been told aren't real, but we know they are. And so the power of the definition of disability in the ADA is it allows us to work with so many people. It allows us to continue to bring new people to the fight. It allows us to think differently about existing issues. And that's what I find to be so exciting is, I actually end every day of work. Actually, something I ask my scheduler to do is my last meeting of the day is always with someone I like, always somebody I'm excited to talk to, because then you end up ending the day in a much better mood. And it's better for not just you, but for your loved ones. Like my husband can tell when I come home after I've had a day where I've talked to people I didn't want to talk to. And doing things like being deliberate and intentional. And I see some of y'all laughing. You know what I'm talking about when you look at your schedule and you're like, oh, that fourth, like not only do I have a 4:30, but it's with that person. Yeah, don't schedule them at 4:30. Schedule someone you like at 4:30. It's okay to move schedules around. It might feel radical the first time you do it, but like it's part of accommodating our own work. And so I think really being strategic in finding ways to fill your cup is important. And the last thing I will say, and I will say this as a complete nerd, is that everybody should go see The Marvels. I highly recommend it. It is an amazing film. Don't listen to the critics. It is awesome and powerful and really empowering for women. So go see The Marvels. It'll make you feel better. Then get back in the fight tomorrow.
Thank you. That's some great advice. And I think we're all going to be a little concerned if we have a 4:30 appointment moved. What other questions do we have for Rebecca?
Hi, it's Carol Conway. This is a really nerdy one, but important for us. We don't have data on IDD anywhere in the state or IDD housing needs. Is that something census can somehow collect?
Census may have it. I think one of I would actually tell everybody, pay attention to the conversation happening around the census right now. They're actually, the proposal going forward will extremely limit the disability count by approximately a third. And so there's a public comment period happening right now. If you Google public comment, disability census, they're looking at actually using a stricter criteria that will result in a significant undercount of people with disabilities. I would look at the Administration for Community Living's website and the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services websites for good data. I also know there's a growing organization right now, it's one of our grantees called the New Disabled South, which is doing some phenomenal work around regional issues, and housing is one of the issues that they find that they're particularly fired up about. I would suggest also connecting with them and seeing if they have any data or the ability to pull any data for you all.
Thank you. Any other questions for Rebecca?
Hey, Rebecca, Holly Riddle. I'm the State's Olmsted lead. We've got some powerful tools in the toolkit, and I wonder if you'd take a minute and talk as much as you can or will about how the ABLE Act, the proposed 504 regs, and Olmsted itself advance economic justice and or housing, inclusive housing in the community. Thanks.
Absolutely. I can't talk about 504 because I can't talk about regulations that are pending. Being in philanthropy, they're really strict about that. I will just say that I would definitely strongly encourage everyone to look at what's going on around Section 504. I know HHS has put out some draft language for folks to respond to. And we are funding at Ford some work for the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights as it relates to 504, because the previous administration fired all 200 civil rights investigators at OCR, and so they had no ability to do 504 regs. And so we're actually we made a grant to a university that's going to be working with the Department of Ed on their 504 regs. I mean, the ABLE Act we know is a phenomenal program. It is a account that families can set up to store assets for people with disabilities. I think one of the big, and the age requirements have shifted in a very positive way to be more inclusive of people that need them. I do think one of the challenges with ABLE is you have to have assets to begin with. And a lot of families with people with disabilities don't have assets. because of just the need to spend down. And so I think that, that's why we're continuing to see the fighting and the advocacy efforts around shifting how asset determination, to allow people to start to save more so that they actually have assets to put away in Able Act accounts. Olmsted, my comment continues to be, if you would have told me that we would get Space Force before we got ADA or Olmsted Force, I don't know if I would have believed you. But I think, we continue to see and have reiterated the promise of Olmsted, the right of people with disabilities to live in their communities and have the supports that they need to thrive. And I think one of the challenges that we continue to see is a lack of funding of HCBS to make that reality happen. We saw originally 400 billion put aside in the infrastructure bill, and that continually reduced to where it ended up being nothing. And I think one of the big challenges we have that I continue to think about is like, what is it that we're not doing? Like, is our messaging wrong? Are our storytelling campaigns not what is it that's, we continue to hear people say we care about the care economy. We need to see increased funding for home and community-based services, but we're not seeing proposals get across the finish line. And, I think one of the things that that's honestly why we've been trying to get better economic data on the experience of people with disabilities. We've been also funding a polling firm to poll people with disabilities and their families on the issues that matter to them, and to poll on disability issues. Because one of the things that I learned very early on in doing political campaign work was that if a polling firm called you and they found out you were disabled, they took you off the list. Or if you were doing exit polls, they wouldn't talk to people with disabilities. And so one of the first things I funded at Ford was a disabled polling project. And we see that a majority of folks in the country believe that people with disabilities have a right to live in the community, believe in Olmsted when they're taught about what Olmsted actually is and what it means. But the continued thing we continue to hear is that just the infrastructure is not in place to make it happen. And so I continue to encourage folks to reach out to whoever you need to reach out to. That's me using my philanthropy language that I have to use, to encourage greater support for home and community-based services, because we need it. And I think part of it is continuing to demonstrate what's happening in states, and communicating it up from there.
Well, Rebecca, thank you so much for your time today. This has been really enlightening. Can we all give Rebecca a round of applause? And
thank you so much. And thank you all for being so flexible with my inability to travel. I very much appreciate it. And I wish you all a great conference.